This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping take your leadership to the next level. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and on today's podcast, we have a great conversation with David Murrow. David is not a pastor, professor, or theologian. He's just a guy in the pews who noticed a disturbing trend, that churches are losing their men and boys. So he wrote a book titled Why Men Hate Going to Church, which became an instant Christian bestseller, with more than 100,000 copies in print. His efforts have spawned articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chicago Tribune, to name a few. You may have seen him on PBS, NBC Nightly News, or the Fox News Channel talking about the gender gap. David makes his living as a TV producer and writer. He's married with 3 children, 6 grandchildren, and lives in Alaska. We'll also leave links to his book in the show notes. And now our conversation with David.
Well, this is one of those special podcasts I always enjoy doing where I get to interview interesting people with a message, with interesting insights into leadership, into the church, into the kingdom of God. And today I've got a very special guest all the way from outside of Anchorage, Alaska, David Murrow, who's written a number of books. And I remember first hearing of David a number of years ago when I began running into his very, very influential book, Why Men Hate Going to Church. And I began hearing all kinds of men's groups and churches and other groups quoting him and being impacted by him. And so I've heard about him for a while, but it's my delight to actually have him on the podcast today. So David, welcome, and welcome for joining us today.
Thank you, Richard. It's nice to be with you.
And I know you've got a lot on the go even now, but David, tell us a little bit about just what you do, because I know you've written several books that are right dead on where the church and Christianity is, but tell us what you do and why you live in Alaska.
Married a girl from Fairbanks, and the rest is history. So the kind of thing that got me into this whole gender thing was when you work in, I work in television. I've had a television production company for over 30 years. And one of the first things you learn in the TV business is that there are certain ways to communicate with men versus women. There are certain programs that attract men, certain programs that attract women. I began in the advertising business, and there's, it sounds like stereotyping, but it's actually true. There's certain words and images that are more attractive to women than men. And so one day I was sitting in church and noticed that most of the words and the symbols and the things that were going on in church were very similar to what I had encountered in the media, the things that were designed to attract women. And so I thought, gosh, and then I looked around and I counted noses, and over 60% of the noses around me had lipstick underneath. So I began to think, every time I'm with Christians, there's usually more women than men, and the women seem to get it in a way the men don't. The men kind of seem dragged along, or they're just not as engaged as the women. So I thought, well, there's got to be a book about this. And so I went on to this is back in 2005. There was this brand new site called Amazon.com. I went around there and looked and saw, and there really was never a book about this. And so I prayed about it, and God said, you write it. And so we released Why Men Hate Going to Church in 2005, and the New York Times called, and the Wall Street Journal called, and I had really touched a nerve, really identified something that was a problem, not just in a church, but an issue from a secular perspective as well. People were asking, why are there always more women than men in church?
And you mentioned, in fact, that of the world religions, like Islam has a predominance of men in it. And
that's correct.
But atheists, there's more predominant men. But Christianity,
Yes.
you said, is the only major world religion where there's more women than men.
Yeah, let me put a finer point on that. There are most religions, with the exception of Islam, have slightly higher female participation than male participation. Islam is the outlier. Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, usually more men than women, but that's because of their heavy emphasis on the male mission, the young men's mission. But among most world religions, women predominate slightly. In Christianity, it's a huge gender gap. Usually, here in the U.S., the typical U.S. congregation draws an adult crowd that's 61% female. No other religion comes close to that. And a lot of overseas missions, the leadership is 70-80% female. So yeah, it's a huge issue, and it's worldwide. Every strain of Christianity, from Catholicism through evangelicalism has this gender gap. Interestingly, there is one strain of Christianity that is about gender balanced, and that's orthodoxy.
Really?
Yeah. The American Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, very ceremonial, smells and bells, very traditional, tends to draw as many men as women.
Wow. And now I noticed also you said that among Christian churches, by far the one that had the biggest gender gap between men and women was the African American church.
Yes, that is correct.
Is there a reason for that? I mean,
well, now we're getting into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, I'll get you in trouble here.
No, I think the African American church is renowned for several things. First of all, very emotive worship services, expressive worship services. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you think of being publicly emotional, men pay a price for that. When we teach boys from a young age, big boys don't cry. They don't show their emotions. They hold their cards close to their vest. Yet when an African-American man enters a church, there's a lot of people getting very excited, very emotional, crying out, maybe even crying or weeping or jumping over a pew. That's sort of the reputation, is very emotional. Yeah. So women have an easier time showing emotion in public than men. The other strike against predominantly black churches is the length of service. Traditionally, black churches have gone 2 or 3 hours with sermons that go 90 minutes or more. And, men are much less likely to find that engaging than women.
Yeah. And, that's very interesting to me. And, this book is just packed with interesting surveys and statistics and insights. And I appreciate your humor as well. You had me laughing a number of times, just the way you said things. And, I might not admit it in public. I laughed at some of the things you said, but I did privately. But you said one thing that I think is just so sobering, and you said it. It's kind of slipped in there, but you said if you find a church that's 70% female, you might as well begin writing the church's obituary. And so, I'm sure that some of our listeners are thinking, well, who cares if there's more women than men? But there is a concern for that. There are consequences, and
right.
And why is that? Why is it so? I mean, there might be say, well, why should we care? Women, we kind of know women carry the freight for a lot of stuff like that, but there are consequences that are quite sobering to the church if we don't change those trends. And so, why is it that if you've got 70% females in a church, the church's future is in doubt?
Well, I think the church has to be men, women, black, white, brown, young, old. It needs to be a diverse community. And what we're finding is as churches are planted, they tend to be close to gender balanced. If you think about the gifts that a church plant needs, it needs strategic planning, it needs aggressive evangelism and outreach, it needs to make a stir in the community. These are all things that, men tend to excel at. Men are usually more aggressive when it comes to evangelism. Men tend to be, guys are all about strategic plans and outreach and, and then as a church ages, it tends to focus less outward and more inward. And these are the things that women tend to excel at: tending of relationships and making people feel comfortable and loved. I'm not saying these things are unimportant, but if they become the primary focus of the church, then churches begin to decline. And so we have hundreds, probably 150, 200,000 churches in America that are either in plateau or decline. And oftentimes these churches are, even though there may be a man in the pulpit, the de facto leaders and the driving force behind the culture of the church is the women, usually older women. I call them, grandma-driven churches. And these churches are very nurturing, they're very loving, but they're not reaching out to the community other than maybe in social service. They have very little concern for evangelism and church growth and young families and the things that propel and drive the future growth of the church. And so that's what happens is you have these grandma churches and they're 70 or 80% female, and you can pretty much write their obituary. They ain't coming back. Because honestly, if you're a young man, you're in your 20s and you walk into a church and you see a bunch of old grandmas, are you going to think this is something for me?
Yeah, and there's lots of stuff that resonates, I think, and you say this a number of times. You'll say, "Well, just think about your own experience," or and And when you stop and think about it, you realize, yeah, that's what I've seen. And one of the big ones that I know your book had a big impact on was just the whole area of worship. And you have an interesting discussion about modern worship that's come into the church, how in some ways it's been good. But in a lot of ways, the things we do in church now are very much speaking to women and women's needs. And not only are they not attractive to men, they might actually be repelling men. Give us some examples of just the things that happen. You go into a worship service, you're a man, maybe you've been reluctantly sort of dragged there by your wife in the first place, and then the church starts asking you to do things that could just be all but emasculating sometimes.
Yeah, right. Oh, well, this is a tough one to talk about now in the light of COVID and the social distancing, because that COVID has wiped out a lot of these intimate practices I talked about in the book.
Yeah.
One of them is, hand holding and hugging. A lot of churches are very touchy-feely. And again, this would not be a problem for men who know each other well, who are, consider themselves buddies or brothers. They'll give each other a hug. What I'm talking about is, in a culture where everyone is supposed to hug everyone else, if two men are forced to hold hands next to each other or lock up, in a hug, that can be tough. You were talking about the worship songs. I would say around the turn of the century, there was a very, very feminine feel to our worship songs. Jesus, hold me close, love me, hold me to your bosom. These sorts of expressions that they almost sound homoerotic, if I might. It sounds like the songs that a man. It's uncomfortable for a man to say those words to another man, even if his name is Jesus. The undertones just aren't right. We used to have songs in the church that spoke of battle and blood and conquering and these sorts of things. They were called hymns. Perhaps you remember those. I don't think they're not
Onward
sung
Christian
too much
soldiers.
anymore. Oh yeah. You can't sing that anymore. They're too warlike. So the imagery has gone from a lot of the hymns spoke of our mission. Today's praise and worship songs talk about our relationship, and so men tend to be more motivated by mission. Women tend to be more motivated by relationships. And if you doubt me, just look at the movies women choose to watch. It's chick flicks. It's all about a relationship. Men tend to watch, hero movies where there's a mission. And of course, there's overlap between the genders. I know I'm generalizing, but generally speaking, men will not choose a chick flick. They don't read books about relationships. They don't pick up People magazine. They're not as relationship oriented as the women are. And so when the gospel is reduced to a relationship in our worship, or spoken of as a relationship or an intimate time with God, with lots of imagery of relationships, it's just not quite as appealing as it is to women.
Yeah, and I know churches meant well, but I remember visiting a church one time. My cousin was actually the new pastor there, and brought my 3 kids with me, my wife, and it was one of those smaller churches that had this family feel to it, and it had been a great service. Everyone felt their hearts were all warmed, and it was ready to close in prayer. And my cousin, just following really the church tradition, said, just reach out and grab hands with the person next to you or across the aisles. And my daughter was maybe 12 or so at the time, or 11, and she's at the end of our family unit, and so she looks over to who she needs to hold hands with, and it's a frazzled-looking man that looks like he's probably a street person. And I'll never forget the horrified look on my daughter's face that I've got to hold hands there. And I remember talking to my cousin afterward and saying, "Now, why do you do that? Like, why would you subject people to have to hold hands with strangers? You have no idea. I mean, if you know that the church is going to do that every Sunday, and you're a man that you'd look around for maybe an attractive woman or a young girl, and you'd make sure you were sitting across the aisle from them, so you got to hold. I mean, it's like, think about all the opportunities for abuse and discomfort there. But these churches were trying to be friendly. And in their effort to be friendly, they were actually scaring people away from ever returning. My daughter was, if we ever were going to come back, she was going to plant herself squarely right between her 2 parents, so that she didn't have to shake hands with anyone else or hold hands with anyone but relatives.
And You bring up a good point. I mean, none of these things that are man repellent are done out of a sense of, hey, let's make men uncomfortable. You know, they're done either out of a sense of tradition or wanting to create that warm, intimate environment. But what we have to understand is that warm, intimate environment is really more comforting to older folks and women.
Yeah.
And the target audience of when Jesus started his ministry, you know, he went out and found 12 young men. And so what is he telling us? Is he telling us he's a sexist? No, what he's telling us is you build on men, and then out of that comes diversity and increase. You've got to take care, you've got to get your guys in the door. And I don't know if you've read through to chapter 16 of the book. The secret of the megachurches, though,
Yeah.
You know, how mega churches become mega is they immediately target men. Probably the two most famous church planters of the late 20th century are Bill Hybels and Rick Warren. And both of those men started their churches targeting a mythical male parishioner.
Yeah.
And it's not that they didn't care about women, but they knew if they got the guy in the door, they were going to get the family in the deal.
Yeah, and of course
so
the statistics are so much higher, aren't they? Like, there's lots of single moms or moms who come to church with the kids when dad's still home, but far, far less likely that dad comes to church with the kids while the mom is at home. It's
and the studies show that religion is much stickier when dad participates. When the kids look up and they see their dad, you know, loving and serving the Lord, they are much more likely to follow in that faith journey. You talk to any youth leader, and you ask them, you got kids whose mothers bring them, and you got kids whose fathers bring them. Now, which kids are stickier in the faith? And it's almost 100%. If the dad believes, those are the key kids in the youth group. Those are the ones who are sticking with the faith. If it's, you know, mom dragging them to church, you've got a much higher level of apostasy in the next generation.
Yeah. Well, you had just lots of great points that has had such an impact. But you know, you talk too just about the feminizing of Jesus. That you go into children's Sunday school classroom, and most of the pictures of Jesus, he's with children for one thing. He's maybe in a field with flowers or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a very safe. But you had a good point. It's like we've linked Jesus with children, and so when you grow up, that's a childish thing. And so then we wonder why 70% or more of our young people that grew up going to church every Sunday are leaving the church once they go to college.
Well, there's good news on that front, though. When I wrote the book in 2005, those images you speak of, Jesus with children, you know, cartoons of Jesus with puppies and children and butterflies, that was really the predominant image you would see. And I think our ministry has had an impact in that because especially I've become friends with Tom Schultz, who's the president at Group Publishing, and they're one of the largest Sunday school publishers, non-denominational Sunday school curriculum publishers, and they also do the VBS. And ever since Tom and I have begun talking and speaking regularly, he has really kind of buoyed up, I would call it, his materials. And so as I go into Sunday school classrooms now and I see VBS curriculum, there is definitely more of an emphasis on the things that boys like. The images look more adventurous. You know, instead of using a lamb, they'll use a lion. And, you know, they'll talk about shipwrecks or they'll use the more adventurous parts of the Bible. And I don't really see as many of these images of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, which, by the way, the reason our Sunday school classes looked like that 20 years ago is because grandmas bought those curriculums because that touched grandma's hearts.
Yeah.
They were the Sunday school superintendents. Today, youth ministry and children's ministry is definitely being run differently, and I'm actually very encouraged at the images of Jesus. Jesus is doing adventurous things again, and I'm actually very encouraged by that.
Wow. Well, I know you had a discussion about Jesus the lion and Jesus the lamb, and
yes,
certainly women were far more attracted to the lamb image than the lion. And I think the numbers are probably still fairly steady, but in the book you say about 75% of Christian products are being purchased by women. So when you look at it was interesting, you know, the men's section or the women's section in bookstores or Christian bookstores, or just who buys them. I know I was involved with trying to get a Christian movie. We're still working on what God did in a prison, a men's prison, and great story of redemption and power of God, but I'll tell you, the number one concern with the movie producer was, but women are going to buy most of these Christian movie tickets, or they're going to rent the film to show their family, and women they're not into men's prison movies.
Right.
So it may be a great story, but they painted the picture and said, now think of a mom with 2-3 kids. She's the one that we're trying to convince to take her family to see this film, and what are the odds of that? So
yeah, the minivan mom, that's what I call her.
Yeah,
and she is the target audience of most Christian products. And, the Christian product market is struggling right now. I mean, our major outlet was Lifeway stores and Christian bookstores. Those are mostly gone now.
Yeah.
There are a few independent Christian bookstores that are hanging on there. But, the channels through which Christian products are sold is changing. And it's actually an opportunity to reach more men, I think, because, when you came into a Christian bookstore, there was definitely a feminine milieu there. There was the simmering potpourri and the flowers on the wall. And, you could definitely tell it was a female space. But now, online you don't have a female feeling anymore. So we have an opportunity to get more men.
Well, you do talk about that, just the fact that men are, that the churches have been kind of decorated by women oftentimes. We, especially if those of us who grew up in smaller churches, there was usually some flower lady that, kind of messed around with the arrangement at the front of the church, or there were some quilts made or different decorations made, and you didn't see any of the men lingering around afterward to try to jazz up the auditorium or the platform. Should we go with a different kind of potted plant here by the pulpit? That wasn't so. When men walked in, they kind of scanned around, and it's like this is not Bass Pro Shop we just walked into. But we don't. There's some things I think that you address, for instance, in that regard. We tend to sort of think, well, men don't care about stuff like that, but you kind of point out, well, they're very spatially oriented. They do size things up pretty quickly, and appearance does matter. Do you find that's still affecting the way people are? I mean, growing churches. They tend to do things certainly much more, I think the way you describe it, is just professionally.
Right. Let me address that in a couple of different ways. You said that it really doesn't matter to men how a space looks. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's true. I mean, men will worship God in a beauty parlor or in the lingerie section at Nordstrom. I mean, if God's presence is there, they'll worship. But all things being equal, a man will not go into a female space. I feel uncomfortable going into Joann's Fabrics. Not because I feel unwelcome, but because I feel like it's not my space. I'm not interested in sewing. I don't know anything about it. Most of the people in there are women. Now I go next door to Home Depot. I feel perfectly comfortable there. So that fortunately, again, since I wrote the book 15 years ago, the decoration motif in many churches has completely changed. And this, again, the mega churches have been taking the lead. They have been definitely decorating or not decorating their spaces, as it were. They've made them look more like a theater, more like just a secular auditorium. They've been using more natural brick and wood and stone to make it more gender neutral, or actually slightly toward guy type things. I know of a church in West Virginia that the guys read my book, and then they built a new like $4 million sanctuary and made it look like a hunting lodge. The place is beautiful. A soaring rock fireplace, mounts on the wall, animal mounts on the walls. And boy, the guys just love to come in there. So, it's definitely a secondary concern, but if your church is decorated according to the grandma motif with the flowers and quilts and, these felt banners that, were cut out, or the other thing would be the kindergarten style construction paper and photographs and yarn for your missionaries,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, those things on the walls, you're really sending a message to men that this is a grandma enterprise, that this is a classroom, a kindergarten type enterprise. And so, you know, you really need to man it up a little bit. And again, it doesn't have to look like a, you know, WWE fight pit. But you know, if you could just kind of make it more gender neutral or add a few accents that both men and women like, the guys are going to feel more comfortable coming in.
If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
I think your book has had an influence. I've like I said, I've heard it quoted and cited everywhere I go across the country. But you do have a section at the end just on just practical ways, you know, not to give up hope, but here's some things the churches can do, whether it's Sunday, and you do have an interesting discussion just on even Sunday schools and how little boys, you know, so much of what we ask kids to do in Sunday school are things girls are typically better at when they're younger, verbally and reading or what other things, and it becomes then we wonder why the little boys are all acting out and attention seeking, but maybe just highlight a couple of things you'd say if a church really says, you know what, I looked around last Sunday and we're definitely predominantly leaning toward the female side. We're not reaching the men. You do cite something that's been, you know, used in various settings where there's just a basic truth that applies to the church, and that is the church today is designed to get the results it's getting. And so if your church is attracting more women than men, it's because you're designed for that. Don't just blame the men. Just understand you're designed that way to attract women, not men. But you do offer some hope to say you can make some adjustments. And so what would be some of those adjustments you might offer our listeners if they're just really serious about trying to change a little bit and be more men friendly in how they do things?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is you, in most cases, you don't have to change your doctrinal statement, or you don't have to change your beliefs. Most of the reasons men don't go to church are practical ones. They don't feel comfortable there. Their gifts are not being used. The church feels like a grandma place, as we've talked about. If you want to start with Sunday school, one of the things you can do is just help the boys win every Sunday. A few years ago, our church moved away from a classroom-style model to a more hyperkinetic model. We attend the largest church in Alaska. My son's on staff there. We really like the church, and when the COVID thing is over and the kids can reconvene, what they do is they segregate them by age, and they meet in a large room. There's rock climbing walls and balls you can throw around. When the kids come in, it's complete mayhem for the first 15, 20 minutes. So what the boys come in and have a good time. They use their large muscles. They're not forced to sit still. It's not a lot of drawing, and there is some of that, but there's just not a lot of that sort of classroom type activity where girls excel. It's something that both genders can enjoy. They tend to keep the verbal lessons short, to the point, try to get them active. The songs, of course, when they do singing, it's lots of body movement, Father Abraham stomping, and you've got to do the things that both genders do well at, so that neither one is disadvantaged. When you're talking about your actual church service, one of the things I always tell preachers is shorter is better, especially when it comes to men. So if you're the type who likes to preach 45 minutes, try 30 minutes and see if the men don't start appreciating that. Focus, and that's especially important now that we're moving to screen-based teaching. People normally do not choose to watch lectures on TV, never really have, and so you're competing not just with the church down the street. Now you're competing with Netflix, and so your sermons have got to be more engaging. They've got to get to the point quicker, and so that's one thing you can do to engage men as well. You should preach on topics that men are interested in. In the last chapter of my book, I tell the story of actually a female pastor who has been successful at reaching men by focusing more on guy-type topics. Her sermon series is around power play, sex, money, success, what is real success, the questions that men ask. So instead of just constantly preaching another sermon on relationships. And so, there's just a ton of practical ideas in there that can help any church, regardless of whether it's the church of 40 people or 4,000 people, reach more men. And so, it's a very good resource for that.
It is. And I encourage our listeners, this is an issue. And, I think David has certainly done some great work to help a lot of churches think about this. But it is an issue. And I'm in a lot of services. There are times where, and I'm in church every Sunday. I'm in churches all over the country, but I'll be in some worship services, and they're asking me to do stuff or sing stuff that I feel uncomfortable. And I mean, I'm a professional Christian. I'm in church all the time, and
I paid to follow Jesus.
There's a few times it's like I will not say that. I don't care if we're singing and there's a guitar playing. Like that's just sissy, or I just don't talk like that, or and I'm used to singing all kinds of stuff, and I'm happy to sing, but I think some churches just need to stop and think, what are we actually asking people to do here, and where is this taking us? So lots of things we could talk about, but really encourage people to get this book. It's been out now since 2005, but and as David says, and I'm encouraged to hear some things are changing, but still, I think most churches would testify we're not reaching our men, and if they are there, watch them during the song service. A lot of them are not participating; they're sort of fulfilling a sentence that their wife has levied on them, and but you don't see them engaged and enjoying it like you hope that they would. And so I think we've got to keep working on that. And so I really enjoyed this book. In fact, I've got my oldest son is a church planter, and as I was just reading through this, I messaged him and said, Mike, get this book. As you're building your brand new church, you need to just take these ideas and build them right into the fabric of how you do church. And so he's already he made a purchase since then on Amazon just to go ahead and get the book.
Good.
And he's about a year into the church and still trying to put things like this in place. So appreciate your contribution to him too in his ministry.
Well, good. Well, that's terrific. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dave, for being with us. And just check our show notes, and you'll see all the ways how to check him out, get his books, and see other books that he's written as well. He's got new ones that are coming out. And thanks again, Dave, for being with us. And I pray God continues to bless you and keep you warm there in Alaska.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.